report suspicious activities and call 911 for immediate response. Expect delays. Government officials.
We were always set up to bring, the way I describe it, the world's best teams of hackers together, because the egos, individual folks, that's defense and security have moved well beyond that. We need teams that can really solve these problems, and part of that is the size of the problem, and the other problem is the multidisciplinary nature of it. Nobody is good at all of the different disciplines that it takes to do these things well now. And so we had all of this talent doing all of this stuff, and it was a Fortune 50 that came to us. And they were just like, hey, going to what you said at Wild West Hackfest about the monoculture that's pervading the industry with offensive assessments. And that was the problem they had, there really was only one choice at that time, and it wasn't working anymore. So they came to us, and I realized that with everything they had done, they had basically done like a business case, like out of an MBA, like, here's the report, Bryson, like, build this. And I was like, oh, all right, well, I'm gonna take that to market. And that was where Scythe was born.
Movement, and constant change. Those aren't things that are unknown to us, or those of us who are in the offensive security realm. We're constantly adapting and moving our tactics from one space to another. And part of that adaptation has been based specifically on the cat and mouse game between red team and blue team operations which have grown in their sophistication significantly over the past several years. I traveled out to Pentest Hackfest in Washington, D.C. in order to meet up with Bryson Bort, the founder and CEO of Scythe and Human Unicorn, because I wanted to get his take on what the current state of affairs is for red teaming and where we're going to be going from here.
Yeah, so from day one, we designed it to not be the traditional approach. Almost everywhere in software development, it works the same way. I build something amazing, and then I just start adding code. And that doesn't work in offense, because if I'm doing real emulation, I need to be only these pieces or only these pieces. So I'm not, essentially the red teamer's curse of having to continually refactor to continue to stress the defense is a design feature for us.
You see, information security is a constantly moving goal and objective, and there's few disciplines inside of the information security community that have to be more adaptive than those red teams. And as a result, what we've seen is an explosion of toolkits and tooling for red teamers, for the offensive security folks to leverage in order to be able to perform advanced threat emulation operations. If you're a red team and you need to make tool selection, which tools do you pick and why do you pick them? It turns out that Jorge Orchilles, who's now also in fact the CTO at Scythe, created this product called the C2 Matrix. And the C2 Matrix is all about answering that question. So I reached out to him and we started a conversation to discuss exactly what the decision factors are behind what your tool selection will be, and what tools exist out there like the C2 Matrix that can help us make those choices for our teams.
Yeah, so for an enterprise nowadays, and based on who I've talked to, a lot of students, being proxy aware is extremely important, right? Because the communication outbound, most enterprises block everything outbound with the exception of HTTP and HTTPS going out through a proxy. So being proxy aware and using the proxy settings from the system, right? Not hard coded, because if you're coming in doing initial access, you might not know what proxy to use. So that I think is a very good feature for initial access, being proxy aware. And then the channel, right, we're definitely talking about HTTP here. That's generally one of the main channels that it should have. Most frameworks will have that channel, so not sure if that'll be a feature. And then really, I mean, for initial access, like your first time in, you want to do defense evasion, right? So that means that payload cannot just be an off-the-shelf payload. You might need to create it yourself. Things like being able to customize a variety of things, and I guess this falls all under capabilities, but things like beaconing out with jitter, doing the defense evasion by custom compiling it, having a custom profile, pretty much being able to customize the entire outbound connection, not just sending like a GET request by default, because it's very easy to signature map that.
And so this is a critical question that's been foisted, if you will, upon all of the advanced red teamers or offensive security professionals out there. If you're an offensive security professional in a, say, major cybersecurity provider like Black Hills Information Security or Open Security or Trusted Sec, Red Siege, you're probably doing some work leveraging internally developed tooling to overcome a lot of this refactoring that's been happening on a regular basis on the blue team side and from the blue team perspective and spectrum.
Right after PowerShell announced their end of life, I believe it was around July, August timeframe of 2019, I had just turned in the course. The course is fully Empire, because PowerShell Empire was very consistent, very reliable. And speaking with some of the SANS authors, we all said, hey, what do we do now? What's going to replace PowerShell Empire, if you will? And I got a lot of different answers, but none were very confident as into like, this is it. So I started documenting all that, and turns out there's around 30 or so, and by the time you watch this video, there might be more, command and control frameworks. So started a little project just as I spoke with everyone to evaluate, at least document the frameworks and their capabilities. It's called the C2 Matrix, the C2matrix.com. There's a Google Sheet with all of them. It'll be maintained. It tells you what version we reviewed. A lot of these command and control frameworks are actively being developed. So even like a week before I gave this talk at Hackfest, Posh C2 came out with version 5, which was a major release. Covenant came out with .4. There's a number of brand new versions coming out all the time. So it'll be tough to keep track of, but the original work is there. It's open for anyone to see, and it's a bit of an eye chart. There's 40 columns that I looked at. Only had time to focus on command and control, so not even those post-exploitation things that PowerShell has, hundreds of modules for. So yeah, it's interesting. It was a fun project. Got to, get my hands dirty with a whole lot of command and control frameworks.
And inside of that spectrum of tools, we have, well, things like Chaotic, which is a Windows scripting host base. Prismatica's Gryffindor backdoor is as well. We have backdoors written in Rust, those written in C#, like Covenant and Ravenclaw, respectively. We've got backdoors like Faction C2, which are all based around this concept of shared post-exploitation language libraries. Essentially what we've got is a golden age of C2 systems. But as red teamers, when we begin to explore tool selection, what do we do and what do we pick, and why do we make the selections that we do?
Going back to a questionnaire of like, what is the ideal thing? And like, you can't ask me what's the best C2, because I'm going to reply, it depends. It depends on what you need to do and how you need to do it. Sometimes, based on what you're trying to do, Meterpreter very well might be the right one.
You see, what's so fantastic about C2 Matrix is that it's focused on asking the questions that we need to have answered when we start to develop and select tools for our red teams. Because today we can't really perform these things in a microcosm, and a monoculture around the style of service provision that has been starting to develop steam in the information security community is just not going to be beneficial for anyone. And so when we think about those things, many of the tool selection pivot points that we're going to have to decide upon are based on what our style of operation is going to be, what kind of collaboration is going to be there. For example, C2 utilities like Cobalt Strike and Scythe and Prismatica, they all have this concept of team servers, which means you can have multiple users play, do red team operations at the same time. And for many of these utilities, they also have some kind of UI that makes these operations A, more efficient, and B, more approachable. Because the other side of the spectrum that we have to consider is that we're constantly building upon our teams. But if our TTP, our tactics, techniques, and procedures, aren't approachable so that we can bring on new members and continue to grow and build the team over time, such that the actual team itself is greater than the sum of its parts, well, we need those kind of features in our tooling as well. And so as we begin to think about our tool selection, do we need to operate on Mac OS X or Windows devices? The C2 Matrix happens to be an outstanding utility to help us figure out the answers to our questions.
One of my favorite stories is when you told me about a military exercise where some folks showed up and the EDR that was brought there was gamed toward the tool that the red team is supposed to be using. And I think the client took away the wrong lessons learned because of that false sense of confidence to something where it really was a game on a game as opposed to role because of the way it was treated. And so if we remove the excuse of the supply chain, EDRs are still going to try to game that piece, but if you have the SDK flexibility to individually as a community come at it, no EDR or EDR ecosystem can keep up with all of the innovation that the overall offensive ecosystem is going to unlock and all the different ways it's going to be done.